Good morning, everyone. I'm Ayush, and I'll be presenting a paper titled Containing the Cambrian Explosion in Quick Congestion Control. This work was done in collaboration with my advisor Ben at the National University of Singapore. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend IMC this year, so I'm very grateful the PC could accommodate this remote presentation. But I think I can do better to make this a little more immersive for all of you in Montreal. So give me a second to fix that. Okay, that's a lot better. Let's continue. The Internet's congestion control landscape has grown increasingly heterogeneous in the past few years. And in general, it's important to manage this heterogeneity and keep an eye on how different congestion control algorithms behave and compete on the Internet. As an example, Google deployed BBR in 2016, an algorithm that was significantly different from the then most dominant CCA QUIC. As it turned out, the introduction of just this one new congestion control algorithm forced us to rethink buffer sizing, fairness, and the general stability of the Internet. But what if I told you BPR represents just the tip of the iceberg and that heterogeneity on the Internet is on the verge of becoming a lot worse? QUIC, a new transport stack built over UDP, has recently seen wide deployment on the Internet and is set to become the default transport with HTTP3. Since it exists in the user space, it allows applications to implement their own transport stacks. There is therefore a low barrier to the modification of standard congestion control algorithms in QUIC, and we are already seeing the effects of this new paradigm for Internet transport. Last year, in a short paper we presented here in IMC, we uncovered modified implementations of QUIC and BBR in Google and Meta's QUIC stacks using a new metric called the performance envelope. Our preliminary results then set up the motivation for the work I'm presenting today. We revisit the problem of understanding how CCAs are implemented in today's QUIC stacks with three main goals. First, we want to conduct a more extensive study and measure all the deployed QUIC stacks on the Internet and benchmark the congestion control algorithms they deploy. While at it, we also want to improve the performance envelope metric itself, which is crucial in detecting modified and misconfigured CCA implementations. Finally, we also want to find a way to provide hints to the developers who want to detect non-conformant implementations in their stacks and find ways to fix them. With the goal of conducting a more extensive measurement study, we benchmarked all the deployed open source QUIC stacks that implemented some congestion control algorithm. This meant measuring a total of 11 QUIC implementations, up from the 4 stacks we benchmarked last year. These stacks were benchmarked using a new and improved definition of the performance envelope, a metric we devised to characterize CCA implementations. To recap, the performance envelope was a way to capture the throughput delay trade-off space in which an implementation operates. So say an implementation has some throughput and some delay characteristics in some network profile. We would then sample the time series data at regular intervals and plot them as pairs in the delay versus throughput plane. We would then get rid of all the outliers, compute the convex hull of the remaining points, and use it to define a region called the performance envelope of that implementation. We could then compare this region with that of some reference implementation to understand how the two implementations differ in performance. The overlap between them could then be used as a measure of how similar they were, which we call conformance. In the paper, we discuss several issues with this naive approach, but in the interest of time, I will go over one key issue in this talk. If we look at the performance envelope of real congestion control algorithms, it immediately becomes clear that there is an issue with using a single convex hull to define the performance envelope. On this slide, for example, we see that even though the overlap between quiche QUIC and TCP QUIC is high, this overlap is not very meaningful since it is not populated with a lot of quiche QUIC points. An easy way to deal with this issue is dividing the PE into individual clusters and computing the overlap over them. On this slide, we see that if we measure quiche QUIC's PE while clustering it into two individual clusters, we get an overlap that's a lot smaller and a lot more meaningful. But this approach opens its own can of worms. How do we determine the right number of clusters for a PE? To determine the natural number of clusters, we run an experiment multiple times and start by constructing a PE with a single cluster. We then compute the intersection over union, or IOU, of the different trials with a single cluster and plot it on an IOU versus number of clusters graph. We then repeat this for an larger number of clusters till we spot a clear drop-off in the IOU. We then determine this knee point as the natural number of clusters for that implementation and use it to compute the performance envelope. Through our measurements, we have found 5 new QUIC CC implementations that behave significantly differently from their TCP counterparts. Over here, we list the conformance derived by both the old and the new definitions of the performance envelope. As is clear, the new definition is a lot better at catching non-conformance between implementations. We also noticed that all CC implementations in XQUIC, which is Alibaba's QUIC stack, were non-conformant. This might highlight a larger issue with the implementations of their entire QUIC stack and not just their CC implementations. But what is the impact of these non-conformant implementations? Do we really care? And is there a case for reining them in and containing this speciation? Well, aside from the obvious fairness implications that we discuss in more detail in the paper, a more interesting impact of these non-conformant implementations was on how we can expect different congestion control algorithms to interact. As I mentioned earlier, in recent years, substantial work has gone into understanding how BPR interacts with loss-based congestion control algorithms like QUIC. A common trend observed by all these studies was when the bottleneck buffer is deep, QUIC flows beat BPR, and vice versa happens in shallow buffers. But it turns out in QUIC, some implementations of QUIC and BPR can challenge and even reverse this well-known trend in both shallow and deep buffers. For example, in shallow 1 BDP buffers, we expect BPR to consistently beat QUIC and in turn expect this heat map to be completely dead. However, this is clearly not true for some non-conformant implementations of QUIC. The same is true for deep buffers, where we expect QUIC to do better and the entire heat map to be blue. This trend is also reversed by certain non-conformant implementations of BPR. So how do we contain this speciation and improve the conformance of some of these CC implementations? Consider a fix we provided for MoveFast BPR. We discovered that the pacing gain had been incorrectly set to 1.25. When corrected, we saw that the P of the modified implementation of MoveFast BPR moved down to where it's supposed to be. Essentially, we made an implementation level correction, which resulted in the translation of the P and an improvement in the conformance. Okay, that's interesting, but can we reverse this procedure? Can we pre-compute the translation that's needed and then use it to provide hints on improving the implementation's conformance? Here's how such a strategy could work. Say we have some non-conformant QUIC implementation that's showing poor overlap over its reference TCP implementation. We can then compute the translation needed to improve this overlap and compute the new overlap after translation as conformance post-translation, or conformance T for short. Depending on the nature of this translation vector, we can then tell the implementer what could possibly be wrong with the implementation. In general, if we see a massive increase in conformance post-translation, it would mean that the PEs have the same shape, but one of them has been tuned more aggressively than the other. Therefore, it might be sufficient to make some tuning changes to improve conformance. If the conformance remains poor post-translation, we take it as an indication that the difference is caused by something beyond properly tuned parameters. For example, algorithmic differences in the implementation or some larger stack level issues. For example, in XQUIC BPR, we saw an increase in conformance post-translation across a large number of network conditions, with large positive values for delta throughput. This would indicate that the pacing gain was set improperly. Upon investigation, we found that this was indeed the case, with the pacing gain set to 1.5 in XQUIC BPR. On correction, we saw an immediate improvement in conformance. On the other hand, conformance T was a little less successful in dealing with quiche QUIC. While the translation vector indicated that the sender was putting more packets in flight than expected, all window calculations in the implementation seemed correct. However, we did uncover that quiche QUIC was implementing spurious packet loss detection, and therefore being less conservative than the TCP implementation we were testing it against, which did not implement spurious packet loss detection. Upon disabling this module, quiche QUIC's conformance improved as well. In summary, we benchmarked the CC implementations of 11 actively deployed QUIC stacks. We improved the performance envelope metric and used it to identify 5 new CC implementations showing low conformance. We also introduced a new metric called conformance T that can help developers improve the conformance of their CC implementations. We also identified implementation level differences and improved the conformance of 2 of the 5 newly identified low conformance CC implementations. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions.